think, get started? Yeah, okay. Great. Well, I just want to make sure that everyone is aware that we are recording this webinar so that we can share it with additional families who aren't able to attend tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is MCICE. I'm going to be talking about after hearing loss, establishing a foundation for language growth following diagnosis. And this is especially about speech language development in children with hearing loss between the ages of from newborns to about through toddlerhood. But we are more than happy to answer any questions or come up with any other topics related to speech language development throughout childhood. We have a couple other webinars coming up this summer, the first week in July and the first week in August that will focus on older children. And we have information about that on our website. You can see the link there on the first page of the slides. Okay. So I'll get started. So who are we? We are a team of dedicated specialists in speech language development among children with hearing loss. And our objective today is to share some new research findings and answer many of the questions that we are frequently asked by parents. We anticipate that this presentation will probably only last about 20 minutes, and then we've left the remainder of the time for a Q&A. We've both added questions that we are frequently asked, and we'll also have an opportunity for anyone in the audience to ask questions. We additionally encourage you to check out the parent resources on our website, where you can also learn about some of the ongoing research initiatives at the University of Maryland, and even get your family involved in research, and you can follow the QR code right there. Okay, so today our discussion is going to center around 3 major speech language milestones that occur in the first years of life. So in this webinar, we'll give an overview of some important research findings for children with hearing loss on each of these 3 milestones, and that's how do infants and babies learn to listen to speech sounds, how do they learn to produce speech during early babbling, and then how do they learn their first words. And today we'll start with how do babies learn to recognize the sounds of their native language. Well, one question that comes up quite frequently is, why is early access to speech sound so important for a child's development? Well, just because a baby isn't speaking, that doesn't mean that they're not learning language. You know, language learning starts long before a baby uses words. And one of the first things that babies learn is how to recognize the sounds of their native language. Learning native language sounds, it sets the stage for development of speech and language. And so in order to learn the sounds of an oral language, babies need to hear language spoken around them. So this first study that I'll talk about today, these researchers, they wanted to explore, okay, why is it so important for babies to hear speech sounds early in life? And so the researchers, they measured how well 7.5-month-olds recognize sounds in their native language. And so, for example, the babies might have been tested to see if they could hear the difference between the sound d and g. And then what's even more interesting is that when the children were 2 years old, the researchers brought them back and measured how many words the children knew and how complex the children's sentences were. And the researchers found a connection. So namely, the children who were good at recognizing the sounds of their native language at 7.5 months, they were producing more words and more complex sentences at 2 years of age. So what this tells us is that what these babies are doing in the first 6 months, it's really important. Babies might not be producing much of anything before 7 months or anything that sounds like speech, but there's a lot of speech learning going on in this time, and it helps them learn words a couple of years down the line. Now, what exactly does all of this mean for infants with hearing loss who might get intervention maybe before or after 6 or 7 months of age? So does age of intervention matter for how children recognize the sounds of their native language? And the answer to that question is yes. So in this next study, the researchers divided 150 children with hearing loss into 2 groups. One group where the children were diagnosed and received intervention, either amplification or implantation by 6 months of age. And another group where the children were diagnosed and received treatment after 6 months of age. And then the researchers measured how much language each of those 2 groups of children understood and how much they were producing. And what the researchers found is that after they measured how much language the children understood, here in blue, and how much they produced here in orange, that the children who received intervention after 6 months, well, they were understanding less and producing less language when the researchers studied that. But you can see that for the children who were diagnosed before 6 months and received intervention around 6 months, well, they had higher language scores for understanding and producing than the children who received services after 6 months of age. So what that last study showed is that getting access to hearing and spoken language, well, it's really important. It's not just important for learning speech sounds. It turns out that it's also really, really important a year or two down the line for how children are going to learn words and how they're going to form sentences. But what about specifically for children with severe to profound hearing loss who end up getting cochlear implants? Well, in this last study that I'll talk before we transition to something else, the researchers, they wanted to know, okay, how do infants, how do babies learn to match sounds to actions? And this is actually a really, really important skill for babies and toddlers to learn verbs, for example. So for example, think of this. If you're cooking in the kitchen and you're talking about the actions that you're taking, so stirring a soup or kneading bread, a child could learn the words for those actions just by interacting with you. And so in this study, the researchers measured how well infants with cochlear implants learn to associate sounds with actions. So they measured how well a baby could learn to associate the sound E here with, for example, a ball rolling down a spiral ramp, like you can see in this picture. And the researchers compared two groups of babies, those who received their cochlear implants relatively early, between 7 and 15 months of age, and those who received their implants later, between 16 and 25 months of age. So here, the researchers, they're comparing how well the children who were early implantees learned those sound action associations versus how well the children who were later implantees learned the sound action associations. Well, 1 month following implantation, neither group had learned that association to associate a sound with an action. But between 2 and 6 months after implantation, the early implantees, they started to learn. But even by 9 to 18 months post-implantation, the later implantees still hadn't learned to associate sounds with actions. And what we can take away from this is that the early implantees, they learn very quickly and very accurately, and the later implantees tend to learn a little bit slower and less accurately, even if they do eventually learn. So I'll let Christina talk about this next section.
Hi, so I'm Christina. I'm a PhD student in the Learning to Talk lab and with the Learning to Listen project. So I'll just talk a little bit about how, what we can take from the studies that Meg introduced and talked about and kind of synthesize them and think about what that means for how we can work with younger infants and toddlers. So the approach that we came up with was repeat, read, and talk. So Meg, I don't know if you can progress through that. There we go. So repeating a sound from a word a few times may help your child to hear that sound better the next time in the context of a word. So for example, after saying a word like apple, you could say it again in a way something like apple. This can also encourage your child to do that same thing, repeating the sound that maybe they could produce in that word. Also, reading to infants helps them to hear sounds in the context of a story. Some research suggests that the speech we use while reading aloud may help infants to learn these speech sounds better. And then finally, talking to infants, even if they don't recognize all of the words that you're saying, helps them to practice parsing the sounds and words, which is a critical step in understanding words themselves. And parsing words from connected speech is actually a pretty complex task, since we typically don't put spaces in between words when we're talking. And as you can hear from me, words kind of happen pretty quickly. Speech unfolds very quickly over time. So this is actually a pretty difficult task for kids to learn. So the more practice that they can get from hearing you talk is great.
Great, thanks, Christina. Okay, so now that we've discussed recognizing speech sounds, we'll turn to another important area of early speech language development, and that's babbling. So a big question that we get frequently is what exactly, not only what is babbling, but why does it matter so much for speech development? Why does everyone talk about babbling? Well, the words that we use, they consist of combinations of consonants and vowels. So the word banana has the consonants B and N and the vowel A. And it takes children many, many, many months of practice producing consonants and vowels together before they can ever say words. And so babbling, or the ability to combine consonants and vowels together, it's a critical step in your child's speech development. They need to practice saying ba and na before they can ever say banana. Now, babbling is super important for children to learn words, and researchers were interested to see if babbling was also important for infants who received cochlear implants. And so in this study, the researchers noted how old infants with cochlear implants were when they started to produce their first babble sounds, so sounds like ba and t. And then when those same children were 2 years old, the researchers measured how many words they knew. And lo and behold, they found a connection. The researchers found that the younger the children were when they started producing those babble sounds, the more words they knew at 24 months. So on this graph, each dot is a child. And this child up here, for example, well, that child started babbling at 3 months, which is very, very young. And that child knew 550 words when they were 2 years old. And this child down here started babbling at 12 months. They knew 200 words when they were 2 years old. And so from this, we can conclude that babbling is an important precursor to first words among children with cochlear implants. So if babbling is so important for speech and language development, when do children with cochlear implants start doing it? Well, in this next study, the researchers recorded the speech sounds that 9-month-olds with severe to profound hearing loss made before cochlear implantation, and then 4 months after cochlear implantation. So recorded them twice. And here I'll show the difference between the children with cochlear implants and the children with typical hearing. So on this graph, the children with cochlear implants are in red. And initially, before implantation, they produce fewer sounds like ba and t than children of the same age with typical hearing. But just 4 months after cochlear implant use, the children with cochlear implants are producing sounds like ba and t, just like children of the same age with typical hearing. So even though there was a difference in babbling before implantation, the children with cochlear implants caught up and they were babbling at the same rate just 4 months after implantation. And so Christina's going to talk a little bit about some tips we have on how to get your child to babble and produce speech more.
Yeah, so taking all of what Meg has talked about together, along with some of the research that we know about, we came up with an approach of look, engage, encourage. So looking at your infant while speaking to them allows them to connect lip movements with speech sounds and encourages them to explore how their mouth can also make those sounds. Engaging with your child when they vocalize, even if it doesn't sound like language, can be really helpful. Babbling is a social activity for babies, and so parents engaging with them in conversation, babies who have parents engage with them in conversation when they're babbling like that, can help them to babble more maturely later on. And also encouraging your infant to make sounds by repeating after them and isolating individual sounds and syllables from words. So this can be especially helpful for longer words like banana, which can be separated into banana. So this can further encourage your child to kind of go along those baby steps of getting to bigger and more words.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the final speech language milestone that we'll talk about today is a really exciting one for most parents, and that's the first words that your child uses. And one question that might be important to answer before we even talk about this is, how do toddlers learn new words? A fun fact, if you didn't know, infants and toddlers starting around 18 months of age, they can learn upwards of 10 to 20 new words per day. It's really amazing. How do they accomplish this? How do they learn so many new words so quickly? Well, it turns out that children who already know lots of words, well, they have an easier time learning how to learn new words. And what do I mean by that? Well, there are things called word learning strategies that children use. And so in this study, the researchers wanted to know if children with hearing loss, do they use the same strategies to learn new words that children with typical hearing use? So what are some of those strategies? Well, one way to learn new words is via something called explicit association. And this is pretty straightforward. It's where a new object, it's just named for the child, right? And so as parents and clinicians, we use this a lot. We point out a new item like this, and we say, this is a radiator. Well, there's another strategy that children use. It's a little bit more difficult though, and this is something called novel mapping. And so this is a bit of a game of reason. Toddlers might hear a word that they don't know, like radiator, and they're presented with two objects, one known and one unknown. Well, the children should associate that new word with the unknown object, because in this case, they already know the word for dog. And this strategy, novel mapping, is actually how children learn most of their new words. And so in this study, the researchers found that the majority of children with hearing loss that they studied were able to learn new words both via explicit association and novel mapping. And so children with hearing loss, they use the same word learning strategies as children with typical hearing. And we can help children with hearing loss learn words in many of the same ways that we help children with typical hearing. And what's more, this study also showed that the more words that the children knew, the better they were at these strategies. And so in other words, vocabulary builds on vocabulary. Okay, I'll leave this to Christina.
Unmute. So the approach that we came up with, just to summarize what Meg has talked about along with other research, is point, look, and read to help build vocabulary. So pointing to objects can be a great way to catch an infant's attention and start something called contingent interaction, meaning you and your infant are interacting and engaging and taking turns communicating about the same object or event. And also looking at objects together with your infant can help associate objects with words and encourage more communication. So you let your child lead you to what they are interested in some of these scenarios. If they're playing with blocks, go and join them and talk about what they're doing with the blocks and other ways you could play with blocks, letting the child lead the interaction and looking to what they're looking at, helping them learn more words about what they're interested in. And finally, reading to infants helps them map words into concepts in a story. And this is especially helpful for abstract concepts like love or friend that can come up within stories. And these are harder to learn from just everyday conversation.
Great, thank you. So at this point, I will say that we are more than welcome to answer any questions that anybody has. We'll really kind of open it up to that. Any questions that you have about speech, language, and literacy development, you can feel free to unmute yourself. You can write a question in the chat. We also have some frequently asked questions that we've prepared answers to and that we have brought in some research to respond to questions that we get from parents. But we first wanted to give this opportunity for anyone who's attending right now to ask any questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. Margaret.
Hi, I want to first say thank you so much for being here and partnering with AG Bell tonight. We're really excited to be able to share this common goal that we have of having more parents receive information about spoken language and listening development. So thank you. I was really excited to hear all of this research. We see it every day in our practice, and I know so many families are experiencing this all the time. I'm really interested in how children with cochlear implants are learning new words, of course. I wondered if you know of any research that's looking at the intensity that our kids with cochlear implants seem to need. I do think it's related to how young they were at implantation and wear time, how many hours a day the children are wearing their cochlear implants and how much time they're in spoken language. But I'm also seeing that our children with cochlear implants do still really need that intensive work. They need to hear these words over and over, and then they still might not recall them the next day or a couple days later. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about the intensity that's needed with learning new words for our kids with hearing loss.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I mean, it's a challenge, right? Like you're making even under cases of really early implantation, parents are making up for time when the child wasn't exposed to any oral language, right? And this is not an impossible task, but it's an uphill battle. And we showed in some of those first studies that there's a lot going on in the first 6 months of life that really sets the stage for speech and language development. And this isn't the type of thing where we can throw up, we throw up our hands and say, oh, well, all is lost. But it is true that, you have to engage in things like auditory bombardment, right? Where you repeat the same word again and again in a different context, right? In a way that, to basically you're trying to compensate for, the 6, 8, 18, 24 months before the child had any exposure to sound, right? And I think that one thing that we have hopefully been able to demonstrate in the webinar today is like, what is going on in the first 6 to 8 months of life, right? Why is it so important that infants and children get access to those sounds? Christina, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just want to add something quickly. So like Meg said, we're making up for this time where there's some period of not having auditory experience or getting that language input, spoken language input. In addition to that, we know that the signal that these kids are getting once they have a cochlear implant is not exactly what typical hearing kids are getting. And so for that reason as well, they may need more exposures to speech and words to make those connections. And this is probably especially true because a lot of the time in everyday conversation, we have a lot of background noise, things going on. And so we know that kids with CIs also have more trouble with listening and noise than kids with typical hearing. And so they're just going to need more opportunities in that sense as well.
Great, thank you.
Hi, my name is Mark Vandenberg, and my wife and I have a daughter. She's 11 months old with hearing loss. And I was curious, in any of your research or your day-to-day practice, have you seen where a child babbles more without the hearing aids in compared to with?
Margaret, do you want to say something about that?
Yes, that's very common, actually. I see that a lot. And I almost feel like it's the child telling you, I want that sound back. What happened to it when those hearing aids come off for bath time or CI comes off at night? So I always take it to be a good sign that the child is integrating listening into their personality and they're craving that sound. And it's, you hear a lot of that babble come out when all of a sudden to them it's quiet and they're kind of trying to compensate for that.
Yeah. The other thing that I really love about that particular kind of anecdote is it just really demonstrates how social babbling is. I think one of the greatest misconceptions that all of us have is that babbling is meaningless, but babbling is so social. It's how kids learn to talk, right? All that like proto language that they're engaging in with you in the first year of life, like it doesn't sound like words, but wow, is it so important? And like this is an example of like a child trying to use babbling to send a message, right? Maybe not consciously, but certainly, yeah, as Margaret said, like trying to say like I want that sound back, give me the sound back. So it's great.
Well, thank you. That makes a lot of sense, actually. Kind of where I was thinking on it. Thank you.
Great. So still more than happy to take any questions from anybody. I'm going to kind of move forward to just a few frequently asked questions that we have about the home language environment, about signed versus oral language use. And again, at any point in time, feel free to ask a question in the chat or just unmute yourself. We are open books for you. That's what we're here for tonight. Okay. Hopefully, yeah, there we go. Okay, so one question that we're commonly asked, especially we live in the DC area, it's a very multilingual area, and we're often asked by parents who use multiple languages in the home and have a child with hearing loss if maybe their child would be better served if they only use one language in the home. And to this, we often say, if I can get my slides to work, that the more language you use in your home, the better. And that the best language or languages to use are the ones that you are the most comfortable in, right? And ones that you can use in a variety of ways. So you use language in a whole bunch of different registers, especially with your child, right? One language you might be more comfortable singing or you doing lullabies in, another language you might be more comfortable reading, and another language you might be more comfortable speaking, especially with certain people. So the best languages are just the ones that you are the most comfortable in. And we do want to point out that multilingual children, they can take longer to reach certain speech language milestones. And this is a pretty straightforward explanation for why this is. And this is because children learn language from the people who use language around them, from their parents, from their siblings, from their grandparents, right? And a monolingual child, this is the language input that they are learning from, right? All in one language. But a multilingual child is getting language input from maybe 2 different systems, right? And so they're literally getting half of the amount of language, right, in each of their languages that a monolingual child is getting, right? Now, ultimately, multilingual children, they catch up with monolingual children. We know this. There have been decades of research on this. And then, of course, those multilingual children have the very valuable skill of being fluent in more than one language. So we just want to say that, delays among multilingual children, those are common. Those children might appear to be behind, but there's all evidence suggesting that those children do catch up and that then they can use multiple languages. Other questions that we're frequently asked about have to do with oral versus signed language use. And one big misconception that we really want to make sure that we're communicating to parents and clinicians is differences between American Sign Language and Home Sign. So American Sign Language, or ASL, is a full language, has grammatical rules. Some of those rules, they're just different than English. And so what's really important to remember is that ASL, American Sign Language, it's not just signed English, right? It's a totally different system. Now, children with hearing loss who are born to hearing parents, so that's most children with hearing loss, they lack access to a usable language model, right? They have all the skills to learn language, right? But they can't hear language. And if they're not signed to, so they have no language to learn. And so in those particular cases, some children and their families may develop something called a home sign or a baby sign system. And these can be family specific sign systems. They can be simplistic, they can be more complex. Often a child will derive or learn or develop home signs from something called a co-speech gesture. I'm doing it a lot right now. I'm talking and I'm gesturing with my hands back and forth. And children with hearing loss who develop baby sign systems will often develop signs on the basis of those gestures that their parents use. But just an important thing about the difference between ASL and home sign or baby sign is that home sign, it's not a complete language system the way that American Sign Language or ASL is. So it can't replace ASL. And so by developing or only using a home sign or baby sign system, a child might be missing out on some of the grammatical components that they might be learning in American Sign Language, which is the equivalent of any oral language like oral English or Spanish. And then, of course, related to this, another big question that we get is if it is going to hurt my child's development if I sign with them before or after intervention, whatever that intervention means for your child and your family. So it's no secret that there are a lot of opinions on this. And of course, this decision should really be made in consultation with your healthcare providers, your audiologist, your speech language pathologist, someone like Margaret at A Sound Beginning. These are all great people to talk through this decision with. But here's what you should know about signing before or after intervention. Remember what we just talked about, that's that difference between ASL and home sign or baby sign. And so really it comes down to the better signer you are, the more your child can learn from you. And another thing to remember is that children with cochlear implants who learn American Sign Language from fluent American Sign Language signers, well, they reach the same speech language milestones as hearing children who learn American Sign Language and oral language. And they end up with similar, these are all standardized scores, similar scores on their articulation. They have similar vocabulary sizes. They have similar pre-literacy skills in the preschool years. They combine words to a similar degree. But this is, of course, children with cochlear implants who learn ASL, right? So this is that difference between ASL and home sign or baby sign. And then just one more thing that we wanted to make sure that we communicate about sign language is to be careful interpreting research that looks like this. So if you looked at a graph like this, right here, this graph is plotting infants who use signs and infants who don't, and their composite language score. And this language score makes it look very clearly like the infants and toddlers who signed had lower language scores, right? But just be careful sometimes in interpreting research like this, because actually this group up here is monolingual, right? They no sign language, only learning an oral language. And remember what language input looks like for a monolingual child. And this group is bimodal. So they use sign language and oral language. And remember what language input looks like for a bilingual child, right? And so it would make sense that for the bilingual group, the bimodal group, they use the signed and oral language, that they would be a little bit behind in this particular case, right? So it's just a word of caution in sometimes interpreting research that looks like this. Couple other quick questions that we are often asked, especially in the last 2 years, stuff about masks. So there's been a lot of research coming out in the last year looking at the effects of masks on speech intelligibility, on speech language development for children, among speech language development and speech intelligibility for children, especially preschoolers with hearing loss. And from all the evidence that we've been able to collect and read and see at conferences over the last year, it looks like masks do not impede children's speech language development. Children are able to adapt to make use of all kinds of cues like gesture, like I'm doing like this, and pitch to learn speech and language. Now, that's not to say that for children who already rely on visual cues, that the transition to not being able to use them wouldn't take time. It does take time, it does take energy, but children are amazingly adaptive language learners, and they can rely on a lot of different cues. So just as a quick aside to say that children who are blind actually develop language just like children who are sighted, right? And so we know that visual cues are not required to learn speech and language. And it goes to show that even in the absence of one kind of sense, in this case sight, children are able to compensate and learn language in other ways. Okay, so I have one more question. Christina, do you want to lead this one or you want me to?
I could do it. One last question that we can hear quite a bit is whether children can learn speech and language from a TV program or a YouTube video. So the answer to this is that children need rich, social, interactive engagement to learn language. So that interactive component is really important, and that's something that can't be done through TV or through a YouTube program. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay. So there's a study done specifically looking at this question about how children can learn language from these different modes like TV versus audio versus in person. And they had 10 to 12-month-old English learning infants that listened to stories in either English or Mandarin, so they could listen to them live, in this case, or those who listen to Mandarin and learn Mandarin sounds. And then they also had a condition where children listened to audio only Mandarin, seeing how much they could learn from just the audio or just by watching on a screen. So it's not interactive, it's just a recorded video. So neither children in either of these conditions were able to learn Mandarin sounds in comparison to, how well the children in the live scenario did. So again, the answer to this is that they really can't learn language in the same way as from TV or YouTube or audio as they can from live social interaction. Do you want to take over this, Meg?
Sure, I can talk about this one. So what that last study showed, and I think a really interesting way, is how important it is for children to be interacting with you in order to learn speech and language. And it kind of explains this kind of intuitive feeling that we all have that feel like my child isn't really learning anything from watching YouTube. But it's not that they're not learning anything, but they're probably not learning speech and language to the same degree or with the same level of detail or richness that they learn from interacting with you or reading a book. And this next study kind of illustrates why that is, and an explanation for that. So for this study, over 300 2-month-old to 4-year-old children, they wore little tiny audio recorders at home for an entire day in a vest that you can see here. And then an algorithm counted how much TV the children heard, how much the children talked, and how much they were spoken to. And what the researchers found among over 300 children is that for each hour of TV that the children watched, it was associated with fewer child vocalizations, so fewer times that the child spoke, fewer words from adults, and fewer conversational turns between children and adults, right? So fewer back and forth conversations. And so what this kind of demonstrates is that not only do children kind of, need to learn sounds, right? But they need to learn how to engage in back and forth conversations. And TV, what this is showing us is it doesn't really allow them to do this. It doesn't allow them to have this kind of social aspect of language learning, right? TV can reduce the language spoken to and by your child. Now, there is, of course, recent evidence that by interacting with a child while you're watching TV, you can help their speech and language development, of course. Commenting on what goes on the screen makes TV watching interactive. And of course, everyone needs a break. And sometimes for your sanity, it helps to put a child in front of a TV, and that is also perfectly okay. But we just want to point out why it is that, what is it about watching TV that leads to some of these outcomes that we know are really detrimental for speech and language development. And we want to say that the researchers, they got these measures from recordings made in families' homes. And this is why this is really, really important research to be understanding what goes on in the home, because it can tell us why language experience in the home is so important for children's development. And right now we're actually recruiting families to help us better understand this. And we'd be more than happy to discuss that with you or anyone you know. So that is our conclusion. You should feel more than welcome to reach out to any member of our team with questions. If we don't have an answer, we will find someone who has an answer for you. You can find out more about our research projects. We can send you copies of any research papers that you would be interested in reading, or if you find a research paper and you'd like to talk about it, you think it's really interesting and you'd like to talk about it with someone who specializes in it, we'd be more than happy to set up a meeting and talk to you. You can follow the QR code to get to our website here. Both Christina and I have active research programs, and we're currently recruiting children with cochlear implants aged 2 to 13. We are recruiting both in well, at least I'm recruiting both in Washington, D.C., where I'm currently located, as well as California, where I'm moving. This is more information about who we are, to remind you, and we are very, very grateful for everyone coming to our first webinar tonight. This is a learning experience for us. And so we'd be more than happy to also get your feedback and answer any additional questions that you have.
I just want to say thank you again, Meg and Kristen, for doing this presentation for us. We've really enjoyed it this evening.
Thank you for having us. It's been really nice to share this with you. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really great exercise for us to think about, all these things that we know, right? But we would really like to be able to share that knowledge with families and help them out as we can.
Yeah, thank you. This is very insightful tonight.
Great. That makes
Thank you for coming.
Happy.
I can make a quick note that AG Bell is, like you said, there's going to be 2 more of these webinars, the beginning of July and the beginning of August. And then AG Bell Maryland will continue these parent chats on the first Tuesday night of each month through the fall. We'll start with it in September and continue on. So this is something that's going to be an ongoing event. So save your first Tuesday nights of the month to join us.
Great. That's great. We're really looking forward to that. All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to end the meeting here. Again, we're more than happy to answer any email requests, anything you want to talk about. We just want to be resources for parents. And thank you so much, Margaret, for letting us share these results. Great. Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.